The moment didn't arrive with sirens or speeches. There was no emergency broadcast, no flashing banner across European news channels. Instead, it began with a sentence posted into the digital bloodstream of the continent. Calm, direct, unmistakable. Elon Musk wasn't responding anymore. He was moving. And across Europe's corridors of power, a quiet certainty spread like a chill. This time, the rules no longer applied. For years, Brussels had believed the same thing about every titan who dared to resist. Pressure them, fine them, drown them in procedure. Eventually, they submit. That belief had hardened into doctrine. But Musk wasn't negotiating influence. He was challenging authority itself. In his view, the European Union had crossed from governance into domination, transforming from a union of nations into an unelected machine that punished dissent and rewarded obedience. And now he was done pretending otherwise. He didn't frame it as a business dispute. He framed it as a breaking point, a moment when silence became complicity. To Musk, Europe wasn't the enemy. Its culture, its people, its history still mattered. What he rejected was the system sitting above them, issuing decrees without consent and calling it democracy. He spoke of sovereignty not as a slogan, but as something being quietly stripped away, regulation by regulation, vote by vote. The flashpoint was Ireland. A nation suddenly told its borders were no longer its own decision. Migration quotas issued from Brussels, enforced through financial threats, justified with language no voter had approved. Musk didn't mince words. He called it coercion, not solidarity, not cooperation. Blackmail dressed up as policy. And with that accusation, the illusion cracked. Because millions of Europeans recognized the feeling instantly. Decisions made elsewhere, consequences paid locally. Inside the Berlaymont building, the mood was very different. Confidence still hung in the air. Ursula von der Leyen and her inner circle believed they were executing history, not provoking it. To them, the Digital Services Act was the culmination of a vision. Control the platforms, control the narrative. They told themselves it was about safety, about order, about protecting citizens from chaos. But power has a way of revealing itself in the fine print. The ultimatum landed without ceremony, hundreds of millions in fines, demands for algorithmic transparency that went far beyond oversight, requirements that would place EU-appointed supervisors directly inside a private company's moderation systems. It wasn't regulation anymore. It was occupation. The assumption was simple. Musk would protest. Markets would pressure him. Shareholders would panic. And eventually, like all the others, he would sign. They miscalculated the man entirely. 5,000 miles away, the response was already forming. Not in boardrooms lined with flags, but in rooms humming with servers and screens. Engineers rotated through sleepless shifts. Lawyers mapped exits instead of compromises. Musk wasn't preparing a defense. He was preparing an evacuation. If Europe wanted control, it would get absence instead. No data, no leverage, no platform to police. He told his team that surrender once meant surrender everywhere. That allowing political overseers into the digital square would end free discourse permanently. To him, this wasn't about X alone. It was about precedent. The moment one government succeeded, others would follow. The town square would become a checkpoint. Brussels assumed the threat was hollow. They believed no company would willingly abandon hundreds of millions of users. But Musk had already run the numbers. He understood something they didn't. A shutdown wouldn't silence Europeans. It would radicalize them. People don't disappear when platforms vanish. They reroute. They adapt. VPNs, mirrors, alternatives. The same tools used under authoritarian regimes would suddenly be used inside the EU itself, and the comparison would be impossible to ignore. As the deadline crept closer, pressure intensified. Another fine was announced, this time aimed at the blue check system. On the surface, it was framed as consumer protection. In reality, it was symbolic punishment. The blue check had once separated the powerful from everyone else. Musk had erased that hierarchy. Anyone could verify. Anyone could speak with the same visual authority as a minister or a media outlet. That equality terrified the old order. Public awareness began to spread, slowly at first, then all at once. The idea that the digital infrastructure of European conversation could simply vanish hit like an electric shock. Journalists, activists, politicians, ordinary users all realized they were standing on the edge of a switch they didn't control. Brussels had gambled that Musk would blink, But he wasn't blinking. He was staring straight through them. As night fell over Belgium, messages from Texas continued to arrive. Calm, defiant, final. And for the first time in years, something unfamiliar crept into the halls of the commission. Doubt, because this wasn't a company asking for leniency. It was a man daring them to follow through. The moment Brussels realized it had lost control didn't happen during a press conference. It happened in silence. In private rooms where advisors stopped speaking and screens refreshed without good news. The assumption that power always bends markets had failed. This wasn't a corporation defending profit. It was a confrontation between authority and defiance, and the rules were no longer familiar. Then Washington moved. At first, it came as statements, carefully worded but unmistakably sharp. Senior American lawmakers framed the conflict not as a regulatory disagreement, but as an ideological assault. Free speech, sovereignty, extraterritorial overreach. Words Brussels had used for years were now being turned against it. And unlike internal criticism, this came with teeth. The escalation was swift and deliberate. Diplomatic channels lit up. Trade implications were quietly floated. And then the signal everyone understood was delivered without apology. Travel restrictions imposed on key architects of the regulatory offensive. Doors closed. Invitations rescinded. The message wasn't subtle. Pressure works both ways. For the first time, the European Commission faced something it rarely encountered. External consequences. The kind that couldn't be buried in committees or delayed with procedure. The digital blackout of X loomed closer, and with it, the humiliation of being exposed as a system unable to enforce its will without compliance from those it sought to control. Ursula von der Leyen stepped before cameras days later, her words measured, her posture composed. But the confidence was gone. She spoke of responsibility, of balance, of protecting democratic values. Yet the contrast was glaring. The audience saw not authority, but retreat. Not strength, but recalibration. The iron certainty that had driven the ultimatum had fractured under resistance it never anticipated. Musk didn't declare victory. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. The principle had been defended, the line had held, and across Europe, the implications rippled outward. Governments began reassessing. Media outlets reframed their narratives. Citizens asked questions they hadn't asked before. Who decides? Who enforces? And what happens when compliance is no longer guaranteed? The conflict had exposed something deeper than a single law or platform. It revealed how fragile centralized control becomes when confronted by individuals willing to absorb loss in defense of belief. For decades, power had relied on predictability. Corporations protect markets. Leaders avoid disruption. Systems persist because resistance is expensive. Musk inverted that logic. He made resistance the point. The digital town square didn't collapse. It evolved. The idea that speech could be governed without consent was challenged openly, not by protest, but by withdrawal. And that act forced a reckoning no fine could resolve. The EU could regulate companies within its borders, but it could not compel obedience from conviction. Now the question lingers unanswered and uncomfortable. If one platform can walk away, what else might follow? If authority can be resisted without tanks or votes, what defines sovereignty in a digital age? Europe stands at a crossroads not marked by treaties, but by choices. The age of quiet compliance may be ending, and whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point depends on what happens next. Not in Brussels, not in Texas, but with those watching, deciding whether control feels safer than freedom. The button exists, the system knows it, and now so does everyone else.